The sun rose through a quilt of mist, stitching light across the pines in thin golden threads. Cold dew clung to every branch like held breath. In that stillness, Silas Coyle swung his axe, not with fury, but with rhythm. The trees didn't ask questions. They didn't whisper about the man who lived alone in a timber cabin at the forest's edge. They only gave what they could, then stood quiet in death. He respected that. 9 years he'd been alone. 9 winters of wind carving lines into his face. 9 springs of sap sticking to his calloused hands. And no voice but his own when the wood groaned beneath blade. He hadn't used it much. A man learns to keep words close once he's been burned by them. That morning he saw her. She stood tied to his split-rail fence, ankles bleeding where rope rubbed skin raw. A cotton dress, blue once, now streaked with mud and shame, clung to her frame like it had tried to flee before she could. Her hair was long, dark, snarled in places where twigs had made a home. She didn't cry, just stared. Pinned to her chest with a rusted nail was a torn envelope. He approached like he would a wild animal, slow and steady, boots crunching frost-hardened ground. Her eyes tracked him, fierce and unyielding, though she trembled all over. He read the note. Mail-order bride. Returned. Deaf. Can't cook. Won't talk. Yours, if you'll have her. R.B. He didn't look around. Whoever dropped her off was already long gone. But the hoof prints in the dirt told enough. Someone rode off fast, like they feared what they'd done might stain them if they lingered. The girl's eyes flicked between him, and the axe still slung over his shoulder. He dropped it, not with force, just finality. Then he stepped forward and began untying the knots, rough from haste, cruel in their precision. She flinched once when his fingers brushed hers. You got a name? He asked, voice hoarse from disuse. She stared, unmoving. He touched his chest. Silas. She watched his lips, but didn't mimic the gesture. Instead, she made a sign, 2 fingers brushing her chin, then pointing downward. He didn't know what it meant, but felt like something holy. He didn't ask again. Inside the cabin, heat from the stove wrapped around her like balm. He set a kettle to boil and pushed a wool coat toward her across the table. Shouted like it might bite. Then, with a slow, uncertain motion, she pulled it around herself. She drank the tea without question. When he laid a basin of water in front of her, she bathed her hands and face without asking why. When he passed her bread, she ate it in silence. For the next few days, she stayed. She never tried to speak. She signed, awkward at first, broken gestures filled with more hope than meaning. He didn't understand most of it, but he understood enough. Hunger. Cold. Thanks. She cleaned dishes before he could, gathered fallen pine cones near the porch for kindling, laid out his boots by the fire without a word. It wasn't affection. Not yet. It was something older, an understanding between 2 people who'd been discarded. He noticed she jumped at loud noises, the door slamming in the wind, the kettle whistling. Her hands would fly to her chest, eyes wide with remembered pain. Silas made a habit of moving slower, softer, announcing his presence by stomping before entering the room. One morning, she brushed her fingers along a stack of his carved wood animals, bears, deer, foxes, lined on the mantel. She turned to him with a raised brow, and he shrugged. Something to do when the storms came. She smiled at the fox, tracing its tail as though it said something to her in a language only she knew. One night, a plate shattered. It slipped from her wet hands, and she froze, body stiff with terror, as if expecting the kind of punishment that didn't need sound to hurt. He didn't move fast, just knelt and gathered the shards, nodding once to show it was all right. That was the first time she cried. The next morning, she began setting 2 mugs out instead of 1. Later that week, he rode into town for supplies. He didn't want to leave her alone, but the shelves were bare and the storm ahead wouldn't care that he'd grown fond of silence broken by someone else's breathing. As he walked through the general store, whispers bloomed like weeds around him. Still talking to trees? Heard he's got some mute girl now. Real twisted. He always did have a taste for broken things. He didn't reply. He bought flour, fabric scraps, peppermint tea, and a small mirror. The last earned him a curious look from the clerk. On the way home, he noticed hoofprints again, this time newer, fresher, pressed deep into the mud near his gate. Someone had come by. Someone had watched. He entered the cabin with a chill beneath his coat that had nothing to do with weather. She sat at the table, fingers busily stitching patches into the sleeve of his flannel. She looked up, hopeful, then noticed the shadow across his face. Her fingers paused. He set the mirror on the table gently. Her face changed. She shook her head violently, hands slicing the air. Then she pointed to her ears and covered her eyes, repeating the motion. No more seeing. I thought. He began, then faltered. She pushed the mirror away, breath ragged, lip trembling. I don't need to hear you to know you've been hurt, he said, more to himself than her. But you're not what they say. She stared at him, unsure if she understood the words or just the way he said them. Her lip quivered. Then, slowly, she reached out and turned the mirror toward him. He saw his own reflection, weathered, tired, lined with shame he never quite outran. She placed a hand on the mirror, covering his reflection. Then she turned it back toward herself, touching her cheek. Not in revulsion, but curiosity. A gesture, not a declaration. He nodded once. Outside, wind stirred the pine needles. Somewhere in the dark, a hoof cracked a branch. Silas stepped to the door, opened it slowly, and stared out across the tree-line. The fence post where she'd been tied still bore the rope, frayed, stained. He didn't remove it. Not yet. Delia May began placing wildflowers in a chipped tin cup on the table each morning. Bluebells, Indian paintbrush, sprigs of pine like she'd grown up among them. She moved through Silas's cabin like smoke, silent, intentional, always fading into the corners. And yet, something had shifted. She started brushing the hair from her face instead of hiding behind it. When she looked at him now, she didn't flinch. Silas carved a fox from cedar. Slender, clever-eyed, tail curled like a question. It took 3 days to smooth its back just right. He left it by her cup one morning without comment. She ran her fingers over its face, then pressed her hand to her chest. A small smile. No words, no signs. Just the language of staying. The snow softened that week. Ice dripped from the roof, and the creek began to hum beneath its shell. At dusk, she leaned her head against his shoulder as they sat on the porch, wrapped in wool and dusk. He didn't move, didn't dare. Even the wind went quiet, as if not to disturb the fragile peace settling between them. But peace rarely stays long in a place the world forgot. The rider came 3 days later. Silas spotted the dust trail before the hooves. A single horse, rider slouched in the saddle like he belonged to trouble. Delia saw him too. She froze mid-step, dropped the pot she'd been carrying, and scrambled behind the woodpile, her breath going ragged, hands clawing at empty air like she might tear a hole in the sky to escape through. The man dismounted without tying his horse. He didn't knock. Silas stood on the porch, axe handle resting beside his leg, hands calm. The man looked him over, slick hair, red face, leather vest stiff with dust. Name's Rufus Bellamy, he said, voice thick with vinegar. I reckon you know who she is. Silas didn't answer. That girl you got hidden there. She was meant for my brother. But he didn't want a dumb mute, so we sent her back. Didn't know she'd go to you. Silas stepped down from the porch. Slowly, the axe stayed where it was. She's not yours, he said, voice gravel and quiet fire. She was bought, Rufus hissed. Mail order don't mean optional. Hell, we even fed her. Now she's squatter's rights for some washed-up tree hermit. Silas didn't blink. She's not leaving. Funny. I wasn't asking. Rufus turned and spat in the dirt. You keep her, he said, eyes slitting. But know this, Bellamy blood, don't forget a slight. Not from some coward who lives with ghosts. Then he rode off, dust trailing behind like smoke from a fuse. That night, Delia signed in frantic, broken motion. Hands trembling, lips parted in silent sobs. He couldn't understand the words, but he understood the story. He knelt and gently took her wrists, stilling her fingers. Show me, he said. She led him to the table, dipped her finger in tea, and began to draw across the wood. A figure, small, female, 2 taller ones beside it. Then lines, ropes, from the taller figure to the smaller one. She marked a belt, then a hand, then fire. Her drawings shook but the meaning was clear. Silas sat back, heart pulsing hard beneath his ribs. The man who tied her to the fence, the one who left her like an unwanted parcel, wasn't just cruel. He was familiar. She had lived under him, had fled him. She looked up, searching his face for reaction, apology, horror. Instead, he leaned forward and drew to. A saloon. A man with fists. A knife. Blood. Another figure on the ground. Then a cross. "Me too," he said. She nodded slowly. Not in judgment, in understanding. The next morning, they moved quietly, efficiently. She packed a bundle of essentials, clothes, bread, the fox. He walked the perimeter, checking rifle powder, splitting more wood than he needed. He didn't say it aloud, but she felt it in his movements. The storm would come back, and this time it would want blood. They didn't wait long. Rufus returned under moonlight, bottle in one hand, rifle in the other. He rode straight to the porch and called out like a man addressing cattle. "Silas, you old bastard. Send her out, or I'll come get her myself." Delia stood by the window, not hiding. Her face was pale but firm. Silas stepped out into the night, coat hanging loose, axe once again resting at his side. "She stays," he said. Rufus scoffed. "You think you're some kind of savior? She's property. Damaged goods. This whole town's been whispering about how you keep broken things for company." Silas's voice came quiet and sure. "You say one more word like that, and you won't walk away." Rufus raised his rifle. Delia moved before thought could stop her. She stepped outside, oil lamp in hand, flame flickering behind glass. She looked straight at Rufus. No sound, no speech, just raw defiance. "Get back inside," Silas hissed, but she didn't move. Rufus laughed. "Well, look at that. She does have a spine. Maybe I'll take her for myself after all." He raised the rifle again. Delia hurled the oil lamp. It shattered at Rufus's feet, fire licking up like an angry god, catching fast on the fence post, the same one she'd once been tied to. Rufus stumbled backward, boot catching on scorched earth. He screamed and dropped the rifle, smoke curling around him. Silas tackled him. They hit the ground hard. Fists, knees, old fury. Silence broke open into snarls and gasps, teeth bared like wolves. Rufus reached for the rifle, but Silas kicked it away, held him down, eyes wild with everything he'd buried for a decade. Then hooves. A lantern. A voice. Enough. Sheriff Amos dismounted, revolver drawn. He looked between them and shook his head. "Been watching that Bellamy place a long time," he said. "Didn't know where the girl went till now. Reckon I do." Rufus tried to rise. "She's—" The sheriff cocked the gun. "She's free." Delia stepped forward, smoke curling around her like a veil. She walked to Silas, helped him to his feet. He was bleeding from the lip, soot streaking his cheek. He reached for her hand. She didn't flinch. Together, they watched the sheriff drag Rufus away. The flames on the fence post hissed and curled, eating the rope that once held her. It blackened, then fell to ash. Inside the cabin, he sat by the hearth. She knelt before him, took his hand, turned it over. Then, slowly, she touched her fingers to her chest, then pointed at him. She signed his name. Not perfect, but unmistakable. And then, hand trembling, she placed it over his heart. Outside, the snow began to fall again. Quiet, steady, covering the last of the ash like grace returned to the earth.